Good day, everyone. Recently in the news, there's been some cause for hope and optimism as the news of vaccines have come to Canada. And so it's with joy that many people are beginning to hope that we might be beginning to see the beginning of the end of this pandemic. However, it also brings with it a series of moral questions. And so I've had a number of parishioners come to me asking about the morality of vaccines. Can we use vaccines, especially vaccines in this case, that involve some connection to tissue that was procured from aborted fetuses? And so I want to begin by looking at that topic. The Vatican has addressed this issue and they've written a document, but to properly understand that document, I think it's necessary to look at a variety of different questions. And so I'm going to do this over the course of about 3 videos, each which will tackle a different question. So in the first video, we're going to look at sort of the scientific basis of vaccines, what vaccines actually are made of and how they come to be. Secondly, we'll look at the question of how morally we can participate, or whether we can or cannot morally participate in something that is evil or that has some perhaps evil origins. And then thirdly, we'll look at the question of, are there other options? Is this the only way in which we can do things? Is this just something that is kind of just the only resort that we have? So we're going to look at those 3 topics over the course of these videos. So I'm going to begin with a kind of technical video, looking perhaps at the science of these vaccines. So of course, first of all, it's important to know that, as many of us do, that a vaccine is produced by taking a virus, injecting it into a culture of cells, having that cell multiply many times, whereby either the virus itself becomes weaker or the cell learns how to combat it. And so over the course of many of these multiplications, gradually you come to this process through tinkering in which you arrive at a vaccine, a cell which is able to combat the virus, in which case you now have a vaccine. You can inject that into human beings and it will multiply in the human body and produce an immunity to that virus. However, in the past 50 or so years, there's been a number of medical attempts to gain those cell cultures, to get that group of cells that we use as our starting point for making these vaccines from aborted fetal tissue. So in the case of the COVID vaccine, particularly most of the cells that are used come from 2 specific abortions that happened, one in 1973 and the other in 1985. And while those might seem sufficiently far removed from us, we might say, well, that was a while ago. Nevertheless, these vaccines, or these cell cultures, I should say, are frozen, are kept in a cryogenic state where they're preserved for many, many decades. And so we continue to use the cells that come from that child that died in such an evil way. And so the question becomes, well, then how are these cells used? Because there's different sort of stages to the production of a vaccine. There's the design stage, which might happen predominantly in a kind of lab setting. There would be the production stage, by which many copies of that vaccine are produced. And then the testing phase, by which you test this vaccine that you've produced by injecting it into other cells or into other living beings, be they animals or humans. And so the question becomes, well, at what stage then is this aborted tissue used? And that depends with different companies. So not every company uses these tissues in the same way. So for example, the 2 vaccines that we might be most familiar with, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, both of them are what they call mRNA vaccines. That is to say, vaccines that are predominantly a kind of a new thing. They're produced on a computer, which is a strange thing for us to even comprehend, but that's how they say they're made. They're not made using sort of natural ingredients. And so as a result, they don't use aborted cell tissue in the design or the production phases. They do, however, use them in the testing phase. So once they produce this vaccine, they test it on those cells that have been procured from those aborted fetuses. However, there are other vaccines that use the process all throughout. So, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which comes out of Oxford, has used the aborted cell tissue in the design process, in the production process, and in the testing process. Then there are other companies that attempt to make vaccines without using any aborted fetal tissue. So, for example, the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. Has as its mandate to, in all of its medical research, to do so in an ethical way. And so it doesn't use any tissue from aborted fetuses. Rather, it would use tissue from umbilical cords, tissues from the uterus, or from different parts of the body that don't require the death of a human being. And so there is much promise to be had in other vaccines and other candidates that don't need to depend upon the death of a human being to achieve that result. So that's just a little bit about the kind of the science of these particular vaccines, which ones do use aborted cell lines and which ones don't. I've attached in the comments a link to a website that has a list of all of the vaccines currently in production, even the ones that are currently in testing phases, and which ones of them use aborted cell lines and which ones don't. So you're free to look that up if you want more information, and if you have any questions, you can leave them below in the comments, and I'll try to get to them. In the next video, we'll look at what are the questions surrounding our cooperation in this evil. How does our receiving a vaccine contribute to this morally unjust system?